Justin Trudeau's cabinet and government appears to be following the same footsteps as the Biden administration in the United States, driving Canada into a massive debt bubble that's about to burst. The United States, of course, hitting about $35 trillion in debt. The new budget, though, up for debate right now in Canada, adds billions more to the nation's deficit. And of course, a huge piece of that is sending money to Ukraine. So what's actually inside of this new budget and how will it bankrupt Canadians? Let's bring in journalist from Canada, David Krayden, who writes at the Post Millennial, joins us from Ottawa, who's been pouring through this budget, God bless you, over the past few days. Now, this is not law yet. It hasn't come up for a vote just yet. It's not finalized yet. But this is what's being proposed, David. What stands out to you in this mess?
What stands out to me is that Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, his finance minister, have added another $40 billion of debt to an already expansive national debt. So this is another deficit budget. Trudeau, of course, when he first came to power, said he was going to offer fiscally responsible budgets and balanced budgets. Hasn't offered one in the last 8 years. And of course, but he says, don't worry about that. The budget will take care of itself. And that,
as budgets often do. Can you imagine running your family like that? The budget it'll take care of itself.
Well, precisely. And of course, they haven't. But we are so awash in debt in this country. And there's $52.9 billion of new spending in this budget. And ironically, the military won't be getting much of that because just last week, Trudeau was in a Air Force wing in Trenton, Ontario, and he announced that he was going to be upping defense spending. That was his priority. Well, there's very little in this budget for defense spending because that's what Trudeau and most prime ministers, especially liberal over the past 30 years, have done, is they say, in 10 years' time, you'll be getting the money. So that looks like what's happened here. So where is the $52.9 billion going? To a lot of boutique programs. They're promising 40 million new homes to be built with $8.5 billion that they've put in housing. This is all definitely targeting, I guess, the Gen Z or Gen X or younger people who can't afford a home.
Right.
But what are we looking at here? We're going to be looking at government housing and people being unable to afford real housing. And this is going to put us in a permanent phase of the government supplying housing that will inevitably just become a taxpayer burden. And so this is not a budget that anybody is really cheering about. In fact, a lot of former Bank of Canada people have been saying that this is the worst budget in 30 years. David Dodge, for instance, said that yesterday, former governor of the Bank of Canada. So there's not a lot of euphoria on the left for this budget, and certainly not on the right, because this is more spending.
There's also a big piece of this is capital gains, right? This is another big piece of this budget, which is just shocking for investors who want to build affordable housing, want to build housing, and then want to turn a profit, right? After all, in the United States, if you partner with the government, there's an enormous amount of tax incentives for you to partner with the United States government. Very little bit of the tax code is actually taking money out of your pocket. Most people don't understand that. Most of the tax code in the U.S. is for businesses to build businesses or home builders to build homes. And of course, if you build homes, then you're partnering with the government to allow, you get some tax breaks, et cetera. You get to write-offs, capital gains, a whole host of issues. But now it seems like Canada is going after entrepreneurs. It's specifically targeting this capital gains. This is an astonishing number. Can you tell our audience about this?
It is astonishing because it not only increases the percentage on capital gains transactions. It basically, Trudeau is redefining what rich people are, because all we heard yesterday from Freeland was, we're going to tax the rich. And of course, it sounds like a bloody socialist country when you start talking like that. Tax the rich, tax the rich. How are you going to tax the rich, Chrystia Freeland? Well, we're going to increase the capital gains tax on transactions above $250,000 from 50% to 66.7%. So now the government's going to claw back 2/3 of that transaction, literally 2/3 of that transaction. And that, to me, doesn't necessarily sound like the super rich when you talk about transactions above 250,000. Most people need to make that much a year just to survive in this economy.
Yeah.
So I think what Trudeau's doing here is redefining what the rich are. He's now grouping at least the upper middle class, if not the middle class, into who he deems to be rich people. And this, of course, is going, and he actually had the nerve to say in this budget that the goal here is the redistribution of wealth in Canada.
Of course.
Now, that is socialism par one. And Trudeau, in his unalloyed narcissism, thinks Canadians are going to buy into this, like he thinks Canadians will buy into all of his schemes because he says so.
You know, one of the big outlays of spending, of course, in Canada has been funding the war in Ukraine and funneling billions of dollars, both in money and weapons, to Ukraine. And Justin Trudeau has championed this, of course. You guys just had a visitor up there from the UK who blew in with his hair a ruffle to encourage Canadians. Make sure, you're sending more money to Ukraine. Tell us about this, because this to me is tied very closely to this budget right now.
Well, yes, of course. And because that's one of the reasons Canada is awash in debt. It's been giving billions way above its ability to do so to Ukraine and for the war, to keep the war going. So former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was in town as a key speaker at the Canada Strong and Free conference. And this is an event that is Canada's CPAC. It brings together a lot of the small c conservative, small c libertarian, as well as the primary people in the Conservative Party of Canada, into an event to network and to listen to each other. So Boris Johnson's invited there. And my first question was, Boris, did you stagger or crawl to the meeting? Because you show up in your rumpled suit, your tie is askew, your hair is all over the place as usual. And what is your message to the Conservatives? Please keep giving to Ukraine. Give generously, billions, please. And the reason? Well, because it's a cost-effective investment, because Ukrainians are dying. Canadians and Americans aren't dying. NATO countries aren't giving anything to this except money. And the Ukrainians are dying. So it's a good investment that way. And he says, besides, think about where the money's going to buy these armaments. It's the military-industrial establishment in your own country, in the United States. And, of course, Canada has all of those Raytheon and other plants that are American subsidiaries that operate in Canada. So he was hoping that would have a fertile audience in Canada by saying, hey, the armaments industry is getting these dollars, so it's not like they're really leaving the country. They're going into this military-industrial complex, which is sucked up hundreds of billions of dollars now into this war and the war in the Middle East. And, I wanted to see somebody stand up in that crowd. And I was not there that day, but I was able to record. Somebody stand up and say, enough, stop getting on your stand and pleading for war, because we've got to stop this war and we've got to stop giving money into the black hole of Kiev. But interestingly enough, Clayton, just after he made that special announcement to Conservatives, of course, he's supposed to be a Conservative, right? He meets briefly with Stephen Guilbeault outside the main door of the House of Commons and gives him an embrace, shakes his hand, and says, you're doing a fantastic job, Stephen. Keep it up. And this, of course, is the Environment and Climate Change Minister in Canada, who is decimating the Canadian economy, who is absolutely, completely destroying our oil and gas industry, who is part of the carbon tax that is impoverishing farmers, businessmen, people, ordinary Canadians everywhere. And so Boris Johnson thinks he's doing a fantastic job at raping the oil and gas industry in Canada. I ask you, Clayton, do these politicians have any ideals, have any principles, any sense of what they really stand up for except themselves anymore? I don't know.
I don't know. You'd be hard pressed to find it. We could ask our audience, are there any politicians out there right now that you could stand up and rally around? I mean, you could probably count them on one hand who stand on principle and who are not motivated by greed or other nefarious factors. Well, yeah, and Canada will continue to dig its own grave by sending billions more into Ukraine. And the United States, of course, the vote in the House is coming up here, and the United States seems poised to do the exact same thing under Speaker Johnson, sending another $70 billion to Ukraine that we do not have, cannot afford, and it will be saddled on the American taxpayers once again. David Krayden, thank you as always for joining us from Canada, keeping us abreast of what's going on up there above the border. We appreciate it as always. Thanks, David.
Well, thank you so much, Clayton.